Hello everyone, I wanted to do an unboxing of a Gorman Wooden Waster and then also do a bit of kind of a thought process and a review in general of what I think about wooden wasters. Now, it was suggested to me that I take a look at these. Actually, a long time ago it was suggested to me, but I also had the opportunity to speak to Barry Gorman himself, who is the person who makes these particular wooden wasters. And they are, sorry, it's very loud. They are relatively inexpensive wasters, and the idea is that you can buy them and use them up. If they break, you're not heavily invested in them. This was about, I believe, about $30. When I picked it up, and as you can tell, it's really very much a no-frills waster. Fairly solid, pretty light, relatively speaking. This is, of course, a two-handed style. It has no real pommel, and so you kind of deal with that. But it is really basic, and it allows for people to do very basic training. The idea of what this waster actually fills in terms of from a HEMA perspective is just someone who wants to have the basic sword shape but doesn't really want to have the heavy investment yet. And I'll speak a little bit to that in the second part of this video, but I really want to just give kind of my real quick thoughts on what this is as a first impression. I have not seen any of the Gorman wasters before, and I will say it's all right. It is a little bit light. I'm not a big fan of light faders, or sorry, light wasters, for a couple of reasons, but for what it is, it seems all right. I'll have to go use it to give kind of full thoughts, but I did get this made out of an oak, or sorry, a hickory actually, so it should last. I mean, it should actually be able to take a bit of a beating. Quality construction looks okay. It looks like it has some shimming that was done right here at the cross piece to keep it all in place. So the general construction seems to be that it's got a fairly big hole. This just gets slipped on over the blade. Actually, the grip itself, the handle piece itself, actually has a bit of a lip. It actually prevents this cross piece from going down past where it's intended to, and then it's shimmed up here at the top. So the construction is actually a little bit different. It's almost the polar opposite of what you'd actually have with a traditional steel sword, but it makes sense the way they did it. And I think maybe it's got a bit of wood glue in it, but I can't quite tell. There's indications here that suggest it, but I'm not 100% positive. So maybe someone who is more aware of the manufacturing process could actually enlighten me on that. But it's all pretty darn solid. Like, this cross piece isn't really going anywhere, and yeah, I mean, I can't do anything with my hands. Now, of course, over time, maybe it would undergo a bit of loosening, but again, for what's essentially a $30 product, it's actually pretty nice. It's been well put together. It's nice and well sanded. There is no burring, no possibilities of splinters based on the current set of it, so it's been put together pretty nice. And it's got a fairly well-rounded tip, although the tip is a lot smaller than I would normally want. In terms of how it deals with balance, kind of like you would expect with most wooden wasters, etc., the point of balance is actually a little bit further out given the overall length of the blade. But yeah, overall, fairly decent quality. It's a step above just having a stick that you break off of a sapling or something. This is going to be much more a sword stand-in and allow you to do some of the basic things you need to do with a sword. And so I think it's probably not a terrible purchase if you're looking for something. There are parts of me that suggest you could actually probably just make this yourself, but for those who lack the woodworking skill or those who just don't have the time, it's probably a good idea to just go buy one. And it is worth knowing this shipped extremely quickly. I think I want to say I had it within the week of purchasing it. There's been a bit of a delay between myself buying it and making this video, and so it's actually sat in a box leaned up against my table for a while. But overall, I think it was a pretty quick turnaround, pretty easy to buy. It's on Etsy. And so if you're looking for the quick, easy purchase to have a wooden waster, then Gorman is a good option. So yeah, I'm actually more or less happy with the quality of the work. Again, it's pretty basic, but you don't really expect much more out of a wooden waster. All right, so let's talk about wooden wasters in general. In HEMA, you have a large number of options when it comes to what type of training weapon you can actually use. The biggest caveat I actually have, the biggest thing that I say is a necessary consideration when you're looking for a training weapon is not actually the price. It's actually what your club uses or the people that you tend to train with, what they have. Because you want to be able to pair like training weapon to like training weapon. So I'm actually holding here my favorite training weapon that I never really get to use, and that's the Albion Lichtenauer. And the reason I never get to use it is a couple of reasons. One being that it's a very, very good sword, but it chews up other steel training weapons. These are just really well made, and they tend to be a lot harder and work a lot better. And if you're using something like, say, a Hanwei blunt trainer, it will be chewed up. It'll look like a dog chewing a bone. At the end of it, it's got all these marks and gnaws, and this won't have anything in it. So it becomes not a great tool for that purpose. And also, these are not, generally speaking, considered good for tournaments. They are not approved for a lot of tournaments. And because of that, it becomes less of a useful training tool. Now, I have one because I would almost always prefer to use a proper longsword stand-in almost over a fader a lot of times as an actual training tool, because I want to use what would actually be a real sword, not a training sword. And faders are very specifically designed for ungloved hands, even though we now use them in the modern sense with gloved hands. It's kind of a little bit backwards, and I think we've ended up where we are for a number of reasons, but I would almost always prefer to use a steel sword stand-in, not a fader, if possible. Now, of course, in a tournament scene, I'm perfectly fine with faders. The other option that a lot of people go with is something like this, which is a synthetic sword, and it's a decent stand-in. Now, I have a big problem with synthetic swords. My biggest gripe, actually, more than some of the safety concerns I have, which I could go into in depth, but I probably won't say any more than that the flex of them could be potentially dangerous on the back of the head, is actually this crossguard. And one of my least favorite things as an instructor with these type of weapons, and these end up being what a lot of people begin with as a synthetic longsword, is that it kind of teaches them to not trust the crossguard. Because the blade itself is actually thicker than the cross, which is the inverse of what an actual sword would be. The geometric principles of how that cross gets used in a fight and whether or not a blade will actually hit your hands begins to matter a lot more. And in fact, because this is so thin and the blade is not, it can actually cause your knuckles to be hit quite a lot more. And of course, you're wearing big gloves, but you begin to learn things that may not actually apply to a proper sword. And while a weapon like this is relatively inexpensive and will last a really long time and has quite a few safety features, like a good flex for something like a thrust, it has some training drawbacks. But overall, I do think this has kind of become the gold standard for entry-level HEMA use for people who can't afford a steel fader or a steel blunt longsword, and they have to get something that is a little bit more in their budgetary range. Now, I've had quite a few different trainers. This is actually one of my first trainers I ever had. It's a New Sterling Arm sword. You don't see a lot of damage on it, but you can certainly feel it. I can feel the ridges that have been caused just from using it. But I didn't get a lot of use out of it because, again, a lot of different HEMA clubs tend to use synthetic, and I'm not going to use a wooden waster against a synthetic sword. I did wrap this. Its handle is normally just bare wood. I wrapped this in, actually, it's a baseball bat grip. So it's just a tape that you apply to it, and it acts like a good, nice, solid grip that you can use so your hand doesn't slide around when it gets sweaty. The thing that I like about wooden wasters is that the geometric principle of the blade to crossguard is actually proper. So your knuckles are actually protected more properly with this sword than with this one. And I do think that is an important thing. I also, being someone who's more interested a lot of times in the history rather than the actual fundamental practice of HEMA, I like trying to train with tools that people might have trained with back in the day, which wooden swords would have been there, but not synthetic, right? So they would have had the ability to make this, sans the grip. They would have been able to make faders, and we know they did, but they wouldn't have been able to make the basically the plastic swords. So I feel like this is always a good stand-in, and because it doesn't bend, it's more dangerous in the thrust, and a lot of people tend to be very concerned about that. And wasters being made from certain types of wood that might break, and even break in a splintered fashion, can be very dangerous. So when you are training with a wooden waster, you have to do so with a lot of care, because you have to be aware of how you could actually injure your friendly opponent. And on top of all that, these things can hit a lot harder if they're made in certain ways. So the new Sterling arm sword, like I said, in my opinion, is one of the best type of wooden wasters. There are other options, like the one I just unboxed, which is this Gorman wooden waster. Now you'll notice that it's actually a good bit shorter in terms of blade length. The main reason for that, I mean, the grip and everything is basically fine. The main reason for the length difference in the blades here is this one's more like an Italian sword. So this would be a really good wooden waster for doing Fiore, whereas this one would be really good for doing some of the more German-based, the Lichtenauer traditions, where you have a slightly longer blade and you're much more focused on cuts. One of the big things I think is a bit of a drawback, whether you're talking about the Gorman or even this one, which I got is a Dmitri sword, which I don't view as one that I actually use in a training setting, is actually weight. See, this new Sterling arm sword actually weighs as much as, more or less as much as a training sword. Its point of balance is right about where you'd expect it to be, about 4 inches out from the cross. It comes in at, I think it's about 1,200 grams roughly, so just over a kilogram, whereas trainers such as this are coming in under 600 grams and really can get almost as light as only half a kilogram, which doesn't necessarily teach you how to use the weight of the sword to your advantage, how to build momentum, how to build power. You need some of that weight to actually understand those principles. So I feel like to this point, having looked at a lot of different trainers, what you want to look for in any trainer, whether it's wooden or synthetic or steel, is you want it to be a good, fair stand-in for the type of sword you're supposed to be using, whether it's an Italian sword or a German sword, long sword or arming or whatever. You need to make sure it's the right thing to be a stand-in, because you want to learn as close as you can to an approximation of a steel sword. And ideally, yes, everyone can go out and can afford a steel sword. But at the end of the day, that's actually not very true. And HEMA is one of those pursuits that is basically free to get into, in terms of it's freely available out there, and pretty much anyone can start their own club and do so on a very, very tight budget. But it's also one of the types of things that when you get to the higher end, to the sport and the tournament side of it, it becomes massively expensive. And I've always maintained that, especially with something like Ringen, it's basically free. You can learn to do some of the basic fighting even without a weapon. But for even something as simple as longsword, really all you need is access to a stick. Get a stick of the proper proportions, and even if you can put a crossguard on it, even better. But you just need to be able to learn some of the movements, how your hands interact with what is essentially a long rod of some kind. And you can actually learn quite a lot just doing that. And I think a lot of people very early on in the lifespan of HEMA actually got their start right there. But as we progressed as a organizational idea, as there were more clubs, as the HEMA Alliance grew, as other historical swordsman groups began to emerge, there were places out there willing to make the equipment for it and actually build us these things. So now it's not hard to go on Etsy and buy a nice little stand-in for pretty cheap. Or it's not hard to go on Etsy and pay a little bit more for a really nice wooden sword. Or go to some of the well-known kind of large, kind of higher-end wooden waster sides like New Sterling Arms. And as much as I'm appreciative of a lot of the other craftsmen that are making swords, I do think if you're looking for a wooden waster, New Sterling Arms is still the standard to go by. I still think they are the best manufacturer of these kind of weapons. or training weapons, and the niceness of a good pommel being there and everything feeling roughly correct. Even though I think the grips are usually a little bit bigger than they probably have to be, overall you get the general proportions of a sword. You get to learn how they interact, and more importantly, again, in my opinion, you don't mislearn some of the things you actually get from using a synthetic. Very often I feel like in HEMA we've gotten to the point as just a community that we actually mislearn a lot, and we don't even really recognize anymore that we have been mislearning some of these things. Had some conversations with some people online about this, that there's a lot of misunderstanding and mislearning because of gloves that we wear or protective equipment. I know I was doing some saber fighting the other day, and wearing the gambeson really restricted some of my arm movements that probably wouldn't have really been a restriction if I'd been wearing period correct clothes or even just no padded jacket. But because we were concerned about safety, we're wearing the gloves, we're wearing the jackets, but now we're actually mislearning some things, and we have difficulty performing some maneuvers that probably shouldn't be so difficult to perform. And we have to recognize that that's a trade-off for the safety aspect. But we in the HEMA groups and in the community have, I think, accepted that to some extent, and I don't know that acceptance is actually the right thing. I think acknowledgement is the correct thing to do there, and then also seek to find ways to train in those pursuits outside of the kind of padded jacket mentality, and actually do things that offer us the freedom to do proper maneuvers. This really came to a head when I began to talk to people about doing some cut tests and learning how to cut with a sword, and going through in my own HEMA club Michael Edelson's book on cutting with a medieval sword, and seeing that a lot of people who spend a lot of time doing HEMA have really just basic problems of edge alignment, because it's not necessary when you're doing pretty much anything else. And something as simple as that, when you get people who are really, really big into HEMA, but have never actually done a lot of cutting, or never really even handled a sharp, which is actually a thing. There are plenty of people in HEMA that don't even own a sharp and never really even used one. You can mislearn a lot of things and never even realize it. So I'm always a big fan of getting the closest approximation you can. I feel like wood is actually better than synthetic, but for safety reasons, we as a community have moved over to synthetic as the cheap option. And you just have to recognize that will have some impact on the type of training you do and exactly how you are training. But end of the day, I always prefer wood. I do use synthetic most of the time when I'm dealing with people who don't have steel blunts. And when they do, then I grab my Reginier fader or my Castile Armory fader, and I go out and I practice with steel, which is probably the best, honestly, but is certainly a lot more expensive. So I just kind of wanted to talk through my thought process on wooden wasters and where they kind of sit in HEMA training. I think they've been largely forgotten by the community. And I kind of think that's actually a bad thing. I think that's drawing too far away from the historical roots of what we try to do in HEMA. I think there's a big push to get away from a lot of the historical roots. You know, we still kind of balance HEMA as an acronym with WMA, Western Martial Arts, and that we kind of pull the history part away from it, which, yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but we should be able to go back to that and say, what are we actually learning and why? Are we treating it like a martial art? Are we treating it like a martial art being learned contemporarily to the Middle Ages or the early Renaissance? Or are we truly learning it in a modern setting, and are we just turning this into the HEMA tournament sport, which is something that I think is not a bad thing, but is just a thing. So I wanted to kind of just give my thoughts on that, because it is something I've thought about for a long time, but never actually expressed, at least not to my knowledge, on video. And now you have my statement on it, so you know where I stand on these things. So yeah, guys, check out some of the options out there. New Sterling Arms, Gorman Wasters, even Dimitri Swords. You have some options out there for wooden wasters, and of course you can always go find the Black Fencer, the Penty, synthetics, or go for the steel and just go ahead and go all out. But when you're on a budget, begin thinking about how you'd want to approach building up your tool set. A great place to start is actually just with a nice, cheap wooden waster. Just do so safely, guys. Cheers.